A critical decision has come from the USA. The long-range missiles requested by Ukraine to launch attacks on strategic points in the center of Russia will arrive in Kyiv very soon. Details about the JASSM model missiles, which will allow Ukraine to conduct operations on the Russian capital Moscow and the Crimean Peninsula, have caused a great panic in Russia. The developments in the recent period of the Russia-Ukraine war, which has been going on for almost 3 years, have led to a complete change of roles on the battlefield. The Ukrainian army, which has set out a much more offensive strategy in 2024 and has moved to move the war to Russia, has turned the balance largely in its favor with the cross-border ground operation it launched in Kursk Oblast in August. Caught completely unprepared by this sudden move of the Ukrainian army, which has been making progress on Russian territory for close to a month, Moscow has paid the price very heavily for the lack of any contingency plan. Monday, August 26th, Moscow decided to launch airstrikes as a last resort to repel the Ukrainian forces from Russian territory, which they could not prevent in ground battles. And these attacks ignited a huge crisis on the agenda of world politics. The countries of the Western Bloc, which have taken action to prevent the continuation of the destruction caused by Moscow, which has carried out attacks without distinction of target, in a way that is completely contrary to the international rules of war, have announced that they are considering lifting restrictions on weapons systems after a long period of time. At this point, the first request came from Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, personally. After Borrell's request, which stated that Western weapons systems should be allowed to be used on Russia to stop the destruction in Ukraine and prevent Russian attacks, many Western countries, including the United States, decided to put the issue back on the agenda. The biggest question of curiosity was whether the United States, which has so far maintained these restrictions so that tensions do not escalate and a possible nuclear conflict with Russia does not start, will change its decision. At this point, Kyiv, which sent a delegation to Washington to convince its ally, had the opportunity to share a list of strategic targets for attacks that they will organize if the restrictions are lifted with the national security advisors of the United States, France, Great Britain. After the meeting, Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov stated that the meeting was fruitful and that they will follow the process with great curiosity, noting once again that Ukraine's self-defense struggle is highly connected with the decision to be made by Washington. The expected answer arrived on September 3rd. As you may recall, the Politico news agency claimed in a news report published a month ago that the Biden administration was ready to provide JASSM missiles to Ukraine. Shortly after these allegations, which have a huge impact on the agenda of world politics, a statement came from the United States personally on the issue on September 3rd. The White House is close to an agreement to provide Ukraine with long-range cruise missiles capable of reaching deep into Russia, U.S. officials said, also touching on details about the date of the shipment, stating that Kyiv may have to wait a few more months for the technical problems to be solved. The officials argued that if these problems are solved, Ukraine will soon get air-to-ground joint standoff missiles. Anticipating that the JASSM missiles will be included in one of the support packages to be delivered to Kyiv in the autumn months, the officials argued that with this development, the conflicts will evolve in a completely different direction from the strategic direction. The JASSM missiles, which are said to make it difficult for Russia to continue its attacks, have a long range that will lead to at least 30 air bases in Russia becoming open targets. However, the fact that these missiles have been produced so far only to be integrated into US-made warplanes prevents Kyiv from being able to use these missiles immediately. Currently, the Ukrainian Air Force inventory has F-16 model fighter jets, each of which can carry 2 JASSM missiles. However, Ukraine's procurement of the required number of F-16 fighter jets could lead to a major delay. For this reason, U.S. officials stated that integration studies have been initiated to ensure that JASSM missiles can be used on MiG-29, Su-24, and Su-27 Soviet-era jets included in the inventory of the Ukrainian Air Force. It should also not be forgotten that there are variants of JASSM missiles at this point. It is known that the older model JASSMs have a range of about 370 kilometers. This older variant, which is 4 meters long, was produced with the focus of secrecy in mind, unlike the renovated JASSM missiles. Thanks to this, the older model JASSM missiles, which are more difficult to detect on radars compared to their counterparts, have brought great mobility to the modern war industry by being able to fly from low altitude and follow devious routes that can enable them to overcome air defenses. In the new models, it is stated that the range exceeds 800 kilometers. It has not yet been announced which of these variants the U.S. will provide to Ukraine. However, it is expected that the older model JASSM missiles, which have a lower production cost, will be easier to integrate into Soviet-era Ukrainian fighter jets, and Kyiv will be able to supply this model more conveniently. The JASSM missiles, which have a large warhead weighing about half a ton, do not have the ability to penetrate hardened bunkers, unlike the Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles that Ukraine recently received from the UK and France. But even with these conditions, it seems that JASSM missiles will be enough to become the dreaded dream of military air bases in Russia. However, the older model JASSM missiles with infrared imaging scanners will have a much more successful performance in reaching the target, experts said. George William Herbert of the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California said, older model JASSM missiles are quite secretive. However, they are not designed in a way that is completely focused on maximum privacy. Noting that JASSM missiles were used in Syria a few years ago, Herbert also noted that Russian air defense systems could not intercept almost any of these missiles, demonstrating once again the advantage that Ukraine will gain. Another critical importance of JASSM missiles for Ukraine is related to the Eastern Front, where conflicts are intensifying day by day. As it is known, immediately after the cross-border ground operation against the Kursk Oblast of Ukraine, the Russian army also increased its attacks against the Donetsk Oblast of Ukraine. The clashes around the city of Pokrovsk, the focus of the Russian army's offensive attempts, were not enough to break the Ukrainian resistance line for the time being. However, Ukraine's withdrawal of the vast majority of its manpower from Pokrovsk and Toretsk in order to take the Kursk operation a step further currently puts the Russian army in an advantageous position in the region. Experts who suggested that if the JASSM missiles reach Ukraine, this advance of the Russian army in Donetsk could be stopped, underlined that U.S. support should reach Kyiv as soon as possible. Do you think this decision taken by the United States will allow other Western countries to make a similar move in the future and lift the restrictions they have imposed on Ukraine regarding the use of long-range missiles? One of the main elements that will determine the answer to this question will be the election of a new president to be held in the United States. The outcome of the presidential election, in which Republican Party candidate Donald Trump and Democratic Party candidate Kamala Harris will face off, may change the way the United States, and along with the entire Western Bloc, view the Ukrainian war. As you may remember, former U.S. President and Republican Party candidate Donald Trump made statements that will shock everyone on a CNN television program in recent months. Trump, who heavily criticized the latest U.S. support package for Ukraine worth $61 billion, stated that if he comes to power, his priorities will be to take steps to end the war diplomatically. In contrast to the Biden administration, there was a great panic in Kyiv after Trump's statements, which underlined that support for Ukraine would continue only if Kyiv took a pro-reconciliation stance. Russia thinks that Trump's statements are election propaganda, and that it will continue the doctrine of military support for Ukraine exactly if the Republican Party candidate becomes president. In what way and to what extent do you think the presidential election that will take place in November will affect the Russia-Ukraine war? Kyiv's making worried statements on this issue leads to a big question mark in the minds, stressing that they will continue to make efforts to maintain the alliance with the United States in any case. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that he will also convey the four-stage victory plan to presidential candidates Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, which he said he will share with U.S. President Joe Biden later this month. These statements of the Ukrainian leader, who stated that the decisions taken by the U.S.-led Western Bloc in this victory plan will have a serious impact, turned all the attention back to Washington. The most critical mistake came from Putin. The airstrikes conducted after the Kursk offensive in Ukraine cost more than $1 billion. Bankruptcy rhetoric has come up again because this cost is much more than the Russian economy can bear. After that, with the step taken by China, the Russian economy has started to drift into complete collapse. In the last days of the Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army began to establish a very great superiority over Russia. The most important reason for this was that the regional dynamics in the Russian army had entered a completely volatile new period. For the Russian army, which faced great desperation against Ukraine with Kursk, the process has now started to move towards a completely problematic point. This led to the complete loss of any advantages that would have been obtained from a regional point of view. The Russian army would pay very heavily for the mistakes made at Kursk. The most important figure Putin assigned in this region was Alexander Lapin, who had previously been the commander of the Russian troops in Ukraine. After the Russian army occupied Kharkiv, Lapin, who despised Ukraine, also faced a big problem because he did not defend the region enough. The Russian army was completely expelled from this region thanks to the successful Ukrainian offensive. However, everything had now turned in favor of the Ukrainian army as well. Lapin, who was dismissed as a result of facing such clear changes in the basic dynamics in the region, was brought to the Northern Troops Command. But this has been recorded as the basis of a larger problem. When the Ukrainian army entered Kursk, the defense of Kursk was carried out by inexperienced soldiers. This was because Lapin had never described Kursk as a target. In this recent period, when all kinds of problems in Russia had shifted to different points, things had started to change completely. Lapin disbanded the Defense Council in Kursk, although a large number of names, also known as anti-Putin, opposed it. After that, he decided to use a large number of soldiers who came to the army as part of compulsory military service to defend Kursk. These were in order to increase the defense of Belgorod, which is considered the most important point in the region. The intelligence that predicted that Ukraine would attack Belgorod directly made a huge mistake. This would have caused the real picture of the defeat to appear. The Ukrainian army has always considered Belgorod as a target, but the real reason for this was not in the way Lapin predicted. Thanks to the large number of munitions going from Belgorod to the Ukrainian region, the Russian army was able to stay afloat. To prevent this, some headquarters and ammunition depots in the region were hit by the Ukrainian army. It was quite difficult for the ground operation to be carried out in this region. The most important reason for this, as we have just mentioned, was Lapin's almost defensive accumulation in the region. Besides, the Ukrainian army also did the unexpected. And by attacking Kursk instead of Belgorod, he captured one of the most important advantages against the Russian army. Of course, before the Kursk operation, the intelligence did not give a possibility to this operation. And after Lapin's mistakes were revealed, Putin came to a very bad point. The real bad news has come to Putin, who has faced a major decrease in the trust game by the Russian people. And in an instant, everything would turn in favor of the Ukrainian army. The fact that Kursk was so close to being lost, and that the requested support was not sent to the region because of the ponton bridges blown up by Ukraine, had started to completely change things. Realizing the desperation of the Russian military, Putin began to send a large number of unmanned aerial vehicles to the region in response. And the cost of this attack launched against the Ukrainian army was far beyond what Russia could do during this economic crisis. The airstrikes carried out at exactly this point have made things a lot worse for Russia. The airstrike launched by the Russian military directly targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Besides not doing enough damage to Ukraine, it launched more than 100 missiles and more than 100 unmanned aerial vehicles. This event was the main reason for triggering a very big crisis. While a part of the city could be easily captured with these, the reaction was that it was spent for the sake of a futile attack. At this point, Russia's steps, or rather Putin's desperation to turn the war directly in his favor, are considered the main indicator of how big a mess the process can progress in a regional sense. While it is unknown what Putin will do about the problems that will arise in the continuation of such a structure when the money spent by the Russian army only for that air defense was disclosed by Ekonomikna Pravda, it would become clear once again what a bad decision Putin made. Ekonomikna Pravda, also known as a joint project of Forbes Ukraine and Ukrainian Pravda structures, actually helps to follow Russia's economic process in many ways. Confirming whether Putin has also faced both the problems he has experienced with operations in the region and the even bigger problems with the process. This formation believes that the cost of the latest airstrike to Putin is approximately between 1.2 billion and 1.3 billion. The fact that such a large cost was actually spent on a single operation against the Ukrainian army has also been recorded as another element that shows that the sinking Russian economy is not being managed correctly. Although such an attack would normally have a large enough cost to allow the Russian army to enter many regions in Ukraine, The fact that the advantages obtained are quite limited is another important factor that shows how difficult things are. This, in turn, causes Putin to make the public pay for the wrong decisions he has made, while it is also considered the main reason why even Russian soldiers are dissatisfied with the current government. The fact that Putin is seen as the basis of all kinds of problems and troubles in Russia, and the talks about captured Russian soldiers, will make it clear how big a problem this is. The Ukrainian army has entered a period when it is actively using the advantages it has gained against the Russian army. 594 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner in the Kursk operation. The confessions and interrogation processes of these soldiers, on the other hand, show what a big mistake Putin has actually made. And this incident, which has damaged the entire prestige of the Russian army, is seen as the main cause of many problems in the region. Although many of these soldiers captured in Kursk say they are soldiers by profession, they do not have the slightest knowledge about the war. The fact that these soldiers, who are tasked with protecting points within Russia's borders, are so incompetent will clearly indicate how problematic things are at a point. If it continues in this way, a new winning streak that the Ukrainian army will get in the region may start after this. This can show the whole world the desperation of the Russian army, whose basic dynamics have shifted to a completely different axis. But in addition, the data put forward will cause some bigger problems to be triggered in the near future. And it could have been expressed as the beginning of the process that could be considered for a direct victory of the Ukrainian army. With these recent wins against Russia, everything has now entered the stage of change. The Ukrainian army has neutralized approximately 620,000 Russian soldiers since the beginning of the war. While these losses are of great importance for Russia, many problems have also begun to emerge. It should not be forgotten that the Russian army moved together with two important units to fight against the Ukrainian army at the beginning of the war. One of them was the mercenary group Wagner, and another was the Chechens. Some of the Chechens under Kadyrov's command switched to the Sheikh Mansour Battalion, an opposition Chechen group fighting in Ukraine. Besides, Wagner disappeared completely after the coup attempt. On the other hand, it is not yet known exactly what Putin, who needs soldiers to fight in the Ukrainian region, will do in the current process. At this point, the comments made by the war analysts were a sign of a big change in every field. According to war analysts, the Ukrainian army has begun to drag its victories over the Russian army to a different point more and more. It is known that this has the quality that will cause it to lay the foundation for a possible domination that will be established against Russia over time. It cannot be determined exactly how the new process that will be created in the continuation of such a structure will proceed. The fact that it is also a pointer to a process that extends towards the victory of the Ukrainian army, which will be achieved at this point, reveals that a bigger crisis is waiting for Russia in every field. And this is a big enough event that it will cause some more important problems to be triggered. Russian President Vladimir Putin was forced to admit during his recent statement that absolute defeat is possible. The Russian leader, who claimed that a defeat for Russia would deeply shake the state structure, brought with him the footsteps of a global catastrophe such as a new world war, stating that they could lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. Russia's full-scale invasion attempt against Ukraine, which has been ongoing since February 24, 2022, has been largely disrupted by the developments in the second half of 2024. As you may remember, Russian President Vladimir Putin ignited the fuse of the war with a statement assuring that his army would achieve absolute victory in just a few months, and that the impact of the war would not be felt in any way within Russia in this process. However, contrary to the promised, the war, which has passed its second year, has started to show its impact seriously within Russia as of August 2024. The complete change of roles as a result of Ukraine's launch of a cross-border ground operation against Russia's Kursk Oblast on August 6th was a completely unexpected development for Moscow. The Moscow government, which has not developed any emergency plans for such a crisis, tried to retaliate by continuing the attacks on the Donetsk region of Ukraine instead of giving an effective response to the Ukrainian operation that has been going on for 1 month. Monday, September 1st, however, Russian leader Vladimir Putin's worried rhetoric in his statement clearly showed that Moscow is not satisfied with this course of action. During the statement, Putin, who stated that a defeat for Russia would spell the end of Russia's state structure, had to admit that defeat was possible for the first time since 2022, The Russian leader, whose hectic change of attitude drew attention to his statements in the continuation of his statement, stated that there is no security threat that would require the use of nuclear weapons by Russia at the moment. However, these statements of Putin, who underlined that they were preparing to make changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine, were interpreted as the footsteps of the Third World War on the agenda of world politics. Considering that the nuclear doctrine, which Russia is preparing to change, has already caused global tension, the statements made by Putin and his team in recent days have been enough to quickly raise concerns. According to the nuclear weapons policy prepared in 2020, Moscow stated that it could activate nuclear weapons if it came under a possible enemy attack or the existence of the Russian state came under threat. However, the fact that Moscow started to organize nuclear weapons exercises, both on its own territory and within the borders of its ally Belarus during the Ukrainian war, when cross-border attacks against Russia had not yet been organized, clearly showed that the terms of the doctrine were applied arbitrarily. At this point, the Moscow administration, citing NATO's claims that it will provide manpower reinforcements to Ukraine as a justification for the exercises they have organized, and the possibility that Western weapon systems will be used on Russia, has displayed a kind of paranoid attitude. Recently, Ukraine's repeated demand to use Western weapon systems for attacks on strategic targets located in the central regions of Russia, such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, and attempts to put pressure on Washington to lift restrictions, are thought to have led the Kremlin to increase nuclear threats. In particular, the rhetoric of Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov has created a big question mark in the minds. Noting that the Kremlin is making an intensive effort to change its current nuclear weapons policy, Ryabkov said, "These studies are at an advanced stage, and as a result of researching and studying the experiences related to the development of conflicts in recent years, the necessity of changing the nuclear doctrine is evaluated as the only way." Ryabkov suggested that the main reason for the need for this change is the intervention of Western countries in Russia's special military operation against Ukraine, adding, "Given that we are talking about the most important aspects of ensuring our national security when this work will be completed, is a rather difficult question to answer." Do you think that these threatening statements by Russia regarding the use of nuclear weapons could it trigger a global chaos? Experts believe that at this point, Moscow will first pay a very heavy price as a result of Russia's aggressive change in nuclear weapons doctrine. Dmitry Alperovitch, head of the US-based geopolitical think tank Silverado Policy Accelerator, noted that the threats of nuclear weapons, which Putin is trying to use as a blackmail tool, have brought nothing but harm to Russia so far. Speaking to GB News, Russian expert Alperovitch said, "The use of nuclear weapons does not provide any strategic goals for Russia. It only makes the situation much worse for Putin." This situation in particular has not changed the perception of the Western Bloc towards the war and has even led to a further strengthening of the support network for Ukraine, thanks to the statements of Russian expert Dmitry Alperovitch. It has been proved once again. As you may recall, the Western Bloc countries, led by the United States, provided only basic defense support to Ukraine during the first phase of the war, such as an air defense system and ammunition. In order not to escalate possible tensions with Russia, Western countries refused to send tanks, long-range missiles, and other offensive military equipment to Ukraine during the first phase of the war. Referring to this situation, the Russian expert recalled that shortly after Putin began making nuclear weapons threats over the basic defense support to Ukraine, the Western Bloc made a serious change in its decision. Kyiv, which has started to acquire such acquisitions as tanks, long-range missile systems, cruise missiles, and multiple rocket launchers from Western countries in a short period of time, has started to contact the Western Bloc and especially the United States in line with a much bigger goal in 2024. As a result of these contacts, the balances in the war may change once again if the Western Bloc countries, led by the United States, allow their weapons systems to be used by the Ukrainian army inside Russia. It is quite obvious that the recent threatening statements of Putin and other Kremlin officials aimed at changing the nuclear weapons doctrine are due to this demand of Ukraine. Putin, who had warned many times not to take NATO's military support for Ukraine too far, had rekindled the Cold War years later by raising the possibility of NATO entering into a nuclear conflict with Russia otherwise. Speaking to PBS about the nuclear crisis, Heather Williams, senior fellow at the U.S.-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, stressed that relying on threats to use nuclear weapons is a persistent trend for Russia. Heather Williams, who stated that Russia wants to scare the West in this way and prevent it from getting involved in the war, suggested that nuclear threats are considered by Russia as signals of its commitment to win the war. At this point, it is thought that Russia will not make a new move until the Western Bloc countries make a final decision related to support and restrictions for Ukraine. Given the allegations that Iran will supply new ballistic missiles to Russia, the likelihood of the Western Bloc announcing its decision in September is extremely high. If Tehran continues to support Moscow, which has so far used Shahd 136 model unmanned aerial vehicles supplied from Iran many times in airstrikes on Ukrainian territory, the Western Bloc countries, led by the United States, may completely withdraw the restrictions. As you may recall, Kyiv sent a special delegation to Washington on this issue at the end of August. Ukrainian officials, who moved to reiterate their demands for the lifting of restrictions on the use of Western weapon systems and to share a list of strategic targets in the center of Russia with their national security advisors, noted that the talks held in Washington ended extremely efficiently. The Kyiv delegation, which included high-ranking officials such as Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, Ukrainian Ambassador to the United States Oksana Markarova, Deputy Head of the Presidential Office Tokitsky, met with U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, British National Security Advisor Timothy Barrow, German Foreign and Security Policy Advisor Jens Plotner, French President's Foreign Policy Advisor Emmanuel Bon, and requested the lifting of restrictions and, along with it, the provision of new air defense systems for Ukraine. Ukraine's Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, Ukraine's ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova, Deputy Head of the Presidential Office Tokitsky. The delegation met with U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, British National Security Advisor Timothy Barrow, German Foreign Policy Advisor Jens Plotner, French President's Foreign Policy Advisor Emmanuel Bon. After the meeting, which was stated to have concluded efficiently, all attention was directed to the decisions that the White House will take in September. There is a large crowd that believes that the lifting of these restrictions will allow Ukraine to achieve the victory of absolute independence much earlier than expected. Some officials express concern that Russia may use this situation as a justification to activate its nuclear threats and that a global catastrophe could occur. Don't forget to share your comments with us about the White House's final decision on the issue and the possible developments that the decision will bring with it. And follow us to get the latest news about the Russia-Ukraine war instantly.